So greetings from the Gambia. My title today is Growth Faltering, Underweight and Stunting, and we're going to be considering this, of course, in the time frame of this overall symposium related to toddlers and preschoolers. First, I must show you my disclosures. I will receive an honorarium for this, and I also have the honor of sitting on the board of the Nestle Nutrition Institute. So you all know that stunting and underweight are key measures of whether a child has had a long-term and medium or short-term, indeed, deficit in their nutrition. Stunting relates to the longer-term deficits, underweight to the shorter term. And these are very good measures at a population basis. But we don't actually mind whether a child is small or indeed a bit skinny. What we care about is if that has a consequence. The first consequence in a low-income setting that I work in would be that it does predict their likelihood of survival. So that, of course, is very, very important. But as we try and get on top of survival and improve that in such countries, then the other consequences really come to the fore. And foremost amongst that would be whether or not it is related to brain development. So the period we're looking at, toddlers and preschoolers, is really part of a continuum. And I want to start off by stressing that, because there's only so much we can do within the toddler and preschool group, because we have already had initial insults, perhaps before that, and there may be other opportunities later. So what we talk about is windows of opportunity to correct poor growth. I start by reminding you that actually the prior generations have a very important effect on the size of the current generation. Now, obviously, there's nothing we can do about that apart from remain patient as countries go through development. We're intensely interested in the importance of both the mother's and the father's nutrition in the period just before they conceive a baby. And we believe this has very long-term and important consequences on how the baby's methylome is developed and hence on their later health. Embryonic and fetal life is, of course, crucially important. And I emphasize embryonic there because some very important things happen within the first few hours of sperm meeting egg in terms of the later size of the person or animal. Of course, early infancy, by which I mean the period of exclusive breastfeeding, ideally in the first 6 months, and then later infancy as there is the transition towards weaning foods, are super important. And then we come to this period now, toddlers, which I'm defining as 1 to 3 years of age, and early childhood up to 5 years of age. Not forgetting that there may be another final window of opportunity for catch-up in adolescence, and we've written about that and shown some of our data. So here we have some children within the age group we're discussing. They've just finished their bowl of mani nyankatango, which is a nice meal of rice and pounded groundnuts and baobab leaves, which is highly nutritious. So one might ask why they are shorter than would be expected. I want to start by showing data from an amazing new set of papers that are available in medRxiv here, and that have taken data from 69,000 children in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So at the top here, what you see are these are the KI cohorts. That stands for Knowledge Integration, led by the Gates Foundation. And you can see in the solid lines at the top that most stunting occurs during the first 2 years of life. So by the time we've got to the 12 months, which is the beginning of our toddler age group, children have already suffered a very significant deficit compared to the World Health Organization standards. And here I show you then the prevalence of wasting, defined as length for age score less than -2 standard deviations. You can see in Africa, it's above 40%, indicated by the red line. South America, below 40%. South Asia, significantly above 40%. What about wasting? Well, that has this characteristic pattern of children tending to grow very well in the first 2 to 3 months of life when fully breastfed, and then starting to show a consistent pattern of wasting after that. The exact level this occurs at differs between Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. And once again, if we look at the prevalence, again with the 40% line there, we find actually that in Africa it's quite a lot lower. In Latin America, there's almost no wasting, and in South Asia, there's a great deal of wasting. So those patterns are quite different by continent. Now, what are the causes of, and there's much to be read in these papers, I'm just going to show you one, which is what are the causes of being low length for age Z-score by the time you've reached 2 years of age. Now, there are many, many causes. You can't read this, so I'm going to show you the top 3 to discuss those. The first is birth length. If you're born short, you're going to end up short at 2 years of life. Now, birth length, of course, is affected by mother's height and weight, and we see clearly that the next 2 variables are mother's height and weight. And in the next slide, we look in a bit more detail as to what happens there. So stratified on the left-hand side by maternal height, in the middle by maternal weight, and on the right-hand side by maternal BMI. And you see the values for LAS and weight for length, Z-score. And the point being is that if you look at the more solid lines, which are the tallest mothers or the heaviest mothers or the mothers with the highest BMI, you can see that by the time we reach our toddler age group, there is a very significant difference between those with big, tall, and heavier mums compared to those with smaller mums. Now, the next question would be, can we recover? Can children recover from this early deficit? Here's data from rural Gambia where I work. You'll see that precipitate drop-off between birth and around 2 years of age. But what you also see, highlighted by the red box, is that spontaneously, without any intervention, there is some recovery, at least in our population. And we believe that occurs when children's immune function has started to get got on top of their infections, and they start to thrive better. What about in other populations? There is some indication, apart from in India in the middle here, from the cohort studies that this also happens in other populations. So I think once they've hit the bottom at 24 months, certainly there is hope for some recovery, a message that you might not universally hear. Now, it's not just about size growth. If you look at the dashed and dotted line at the left-hand side going up the brain and head, of course, we are acutely aware of the need to have good composition to that growth. And I remind you of something you already know, which is that brain growth is very active in young children. And we want to ensure that not only are they growing well, but that their brain and other organs are developing well. Now, in point of fact, if they are growing well, it's highly likely that their brain will be developing as we would hope. So why do children grow so badly? Well, of course, it's partly about poor diets with low dietary diversity, but we need to consider the other variables as well. Subclinical viral bacterial protozoal infections, things that don't bring children to clinics, but are nonetheless affecting their growth. Aflatoxin poisoning, the so-called EED, environmental enteric disease that causes a chronic damage to the gut. Persistent low-grade inflammation is something that we find has a very important effect in the environment we work in here. So what about nutrition, so-called nutrition-sensitive actions that would combat many of those listed on the prior slide? Well, there's one that dominates above all, which is GDP, the gross domestic product of a country, your wealth. And we can see clearly from this that as countries move through the economic transition and gather wealth, then childhood stunting disappears. So that is by far the most important variable. But in the meantime, before we can get to that for all countries, let's see what else we can do. So a child like this, he actually looks in pretty good nutritional status, but would certainly be stunted if measured. And you can see this is clearly not a great habit to be chewing on an old maize corn that's been lying on the ground for some months by the look of it. So there's been a great deal of interest into water, sanitation, and hygiene interventions. And I want to show you data from very important studies that have just been published in the last couple of years. So these are the WASH benefits and SHINE trials. WASH benefits in Kenya and Bangladesh, and the SHINE trial from Zimbabwe. And I first of all plotted the effects of the IYCF interventions, so infant and young child feeding interventions, against the well-known plots of the 54-country DHS data showing the effects of height. So the bottom blue line for each of these studies shows where they were at baseline, and the top line is where they were after intervention, and the red arrow gives us a measure of that size. The message here is that IYCF interventions had effects, significant effects, but very modest effects. Next, we ask, what is the effect of the WASH interventions? And here you see no red arrow because, to our great surprise and disappointment, the WASH interventions had absolutely no benefit. And of course, there's a great deal of thinking going on in the community as to why this was the case. You might say, well, this is a counsel for despair. We're never going to get these populations to really improve their height. I would argue against that and say what it is instead is a counsel of patience. We shouldn't be expecting to take children who are the recipients of many generations of deficits to go from where they are now right up to the ideal WHO centiles. What I think instead is that we need to be patient and we need to move up generation by generation. And that when viewed in that way, then actually there's a great deal of hope that we can adjust these growth charts. So let me end by asking the question, do toddlers and preschoolers require special diets? Younger children certainly do. So this graphic here shows in green the beginning of our toddler group. Against that are the nutrient requirements of the younger age groups, so 7 to 9 months in red, 10 to 12 months in blue. And you can see in the younger children, they do have some very intense increases in the composition of the diet that is required for optimal growth, so about nutrient density. However, by the time they get to 1 year or so, then it is my belief that actually they could thrive perfectly well on an adult diet. So in conclusion, what we need to do is to put together all the elements of the nutrition sensitive and the nutrition specific changes in order to get children to grow as we would wish, and most importantly of all, as we've several times emphasized, to have the composition of that growth in terms of brain and other organ development going at an optimal rate so that we can further the future human capital of nations such as this. And with that, I thank you for your attention.